Hello, my name's Patrick Coughlin from TruSTAR Technology. I'm joined today by Dave Lewis, who's the Global Security Advocate at Akamai Technologies, and Jeremiah Grossman, who's the CEO of BitDiscovery. So if you don't mind, gentlemen, maybe we just give a few words about what your companies do and what problems you solve for your customers.
Sure. So over the last 20 years in security, one of the things I found that really held security back is we, and I should say organizations, really don't know what they own. And if you don't know what you own, whether it's desktop servers or websites, you can't help but to protect it. And if you look at the asset inventories of any company or organization out there, they feasibly don't exist. So that problem is unsolved. So what BitDiscovery does, it helps companies find and catalog the websites that they own. It's a very simple solution to a very large problem.
And for Akamai Technologies, we are a cloud security company. We are basically a guardian architecture overlay to the entire internet. So with our customers, they're protecting against denial of service attacks, web application attacks, credential stuffing, and so on and so forth. And we see a very different perspective from what Jeremiah's company would see. We see massive amounts of data that we collect as a result of our points of presence around the internet.
Yeah. So if you look at it from either perspective, right, the asset perspective or looking at some of the backbone of the internet, who's the attacker and how has it changed over the last 10 years or so?
You know what? The first time I was exposed to it was Mikko Hipanen from F-Secure, and he had a very interesting way of cataloging the attackers. You have the more privateers, the ones that hack for fun, they hack you and laugh at you. Those really aren't concerning to me because they kind of tell you they're there. Yeah. They're kind of the canaries in the coal mine. Then you have the cybercriminals who hack you and don't laugh at you. They just want to steal your money and any data you got that's worth money. Far more sinister. But then there's even one level beyond that, the nation state actors who are hacking for a political reason. You know, command and control, surveillance purposes, you know, intellectual property theft and things like that. So I like those particular classifications, and you have to treat them independently and distinctly if you have any hope to counteracting them.
Dave, I'm curious, are the attackers evolving? Are they getting more sophisticated, or is the scale at which we are seeing attacks increasing, or both?
I think it's more of the case that the scale is increasing. There are some very well-financed, concerted organizations that are out there breaking into systems, but by and large, you have more and more people that are getting into it because the tools out there that allow people to become an attacker the barrier to entry is very low. So it's really, if you have the ability to search on Google, you can find the tools you need and become an attacker. They're not yet necessarily the effective ones, but they add to the background noise in a rather massive fashion.
So it's RSA, right? It's full of buzzwords. We have to talk about AI or machine learning. Are you seeing the bad guys using AI, using machine learning to execute attacks? And if so, are we doing enough as good guys to bring that kind of technology into our stack?
For me, I personally have not seen, nor have I heard about the bad guys, our adversaries using machine learning AI, frankly, because they don't have to. The hacks are so easy. The number of systems they can compromise are so vast. They're using attacks from years and years ago. I think the last Verizon report I read said the average exploit they're using is like a year and a half old. That's all they really need to do. Where AI and machine learning become a value is on the defense side, where we have to do more with the same amount of people. The amount of incoming data that we have to process cannot be handled just by doubling the humans. They just don't exist. So we have to use machine learning to make decisions faster. It's the only way to keep up.
And I agree with them completely on that point. The attackers aren't using it because they don't have to. Right. The amount of security debt that we've accumulated over time as defenders across the board is daunting. Yeah. And an attacker's not going to burn a zero-day when they can simply, mount a drive remotely and be into your network.
Yeah. So what does that mean about how we should be thinking about investment, right? And I mean, you mentioned just having your hands around your assets is a big enough challenge, right? Was out on the floor today, everybody's talking about threat intelligence, right? Well, intelligence isn't something you can necessarily just buy, right? Intelligence is supposed to be something you marry up with your assets and you have a threat model and et cetera. So where do you see folks, how do you talk to your customers about where they should start and how they have a strong baseline of hygiene before they can start entertaining other things like AI and machine learning?
If you read any security standard compliance document policy, the very first step is find what it is that you own, because that's what you need to protect. And it's the one thing the industry doesn't do. And there might be only one thing that every security expert agrees on, and it's you should do that step, but it's the one thing we don't do. Now, one of the things that I've discovered over the last several years is that it's not so much that we don't patch our systems in a timely fashion. Of course we don't. But it's a little bit deeper than that. Many of the organizations that I've talked to would have patched if they knew that a system existed in the first place. These systems are vast. Imagine, like, let's just say the web. We have about 1 billion websites on the web. If it grows just 1 to 2%, and it grows much faster than that, what does that mean in terms of new systems that the IT admins or the security professionals just don't know about, to say nothing about the legacy that came before it?
And to build on that too, you need to have a defense in depth model where you are actually having controls in front of your enterprise to make sure that the attackers can't get in, because you do have a soft underbelly. And I've worked in organizations for 20 years before I ever came to Akamai, where we would find assets that nobody knew about. You know, the system that was built by a summer intern that became mission critical, that was a real problem, but it wasn't in any asset inventory. So if you don't have the controls in place in order to buy you the time, in order you can mitigate these issues that you have internally in network, you really are playing a very dangerous game.
Yeah. So what we really have, when you look at it, we have a budgeting problem, 2 budgeting problems. We have one on the defense side, where we're spending about $81 billion to $90 billion a year for everybody to get hacked all the time. We're spending a tremendous amount of money, and there's no efficacy. It's clearly not being spent on the right things. We seem to chase compliance, and everybody in the industry agrees compliance does not equal security, nor can we expect compliance to keep up with the adversary anyway. Right. And then the second budgetary problem, which we don't talk about, is how much the bad guy has to spend to counteract our dollars. If we spend $1 million on defense, what does it take for the bad guy to defeat it? It probably might be $1,000. If we can close that gap, we'll make progress, and not a moment until.
So how do we close that gap?
Go ahead.
No, all yours.
We have to increase the cost of the adversary to do their job. For instance, if the adversary looks at an enterprise and goes, that's going to take me an hour to break in, that's an hour of time, it's an hour of cost. Whatever trips them up in the kill chain, they might call it, or the attack chain, to double their time, or once they compromise the system, fast detection and response. If I'm going to spend a week on a system only to be detected and kicked off in an hour, I'm going to go someplace else. We don't necessarily have to make our systems completely bulletproof. We just have to be a little bit better than average, so the bad guy, the adversary, will go hack somebody else. And that's a very real thing.
Yeah. And you got to look at what kind of adversaries you have to contend with within your enterprise. If it's a case of they're going to try and come at you and try to break into your systems, and like you're saying, you've made it more not cost effective for them to do that, they could turn around and go take the admin for the CEO out for lunch.
Yeah.
And then, oh, there's another way in.
Yeah. Have you seen their business model evolve as well? Like the attackers, I think about DDoS and the way, or ransomware, right? Are their unit economics evolving? Is some of these different attack vectors changing the way they think about monetizing exploits?
Well, if you look back earlier on, when we had attrition.org, AllDOS, and all those different mirrors, it was all about, hey, look at me.
Right.
So they could break in the system, change it, and that was it.
Right.
And now it is very huge monetary aspects to it, because they can make a fortune. And where they had denial of service attacks and doing extortion type things, that had limited return on investment. They were able to get, numbers vary from 2 to 10% return on their attacks. Ransomware, which he can speak to far more with greater clarity than I can, that is a lot more of a revenue generating engine than the extortion-based attack.
Yeah. The adversary, if they're cyber criminals, are always going to go after the easy buck. That's what they're in the business of. Ransomware is one of them. You could steal the data and try to sell it on the dark web if you want to do that, and you're going to get a certain amount of price. The adversary has stolen so many credit card numbers that the price per has plummeted. That, and there's better anti-fraud systems. So they think about it and they go, if I can encrypt and lock away from you your systems and your intellectual property, who would pay more than the victim themselves? And they profited so much. The next step is we could always look backwards, but it's important that if you look the last 3 to 5 years of just ransomware, these guys have made so much money. Their tools are in baby land, really. Yeah. They're going to start reinvesting their ill-gotten gains. We haven't even seen the start of the innovation, at least in the ransomware space.
Interesting. So maybe 2 perspectives here when we think about what IoT does for the space, right? And what does it do for the assets you need to make sure you have your arms around? Think about healthcare or places where there's tons of devices on the network. And what does IoT do for the ability to execute attacks and botnets and DDoS and some of the stuff we've seen Akamai come out in recently in published articles? So curious.
So from our perspective, it adds a wider attack surface like we've never seen before.
Yeah.
So we're able to see, thousands, well, millions of devices in a lot of cases that are distributed, and in some cases they're using deprecated libraries. So there was one that I saw a couple years ago, which I won't name, but they were using a deprecated OpenSSL library that reintroduced Heartbleed into the mix. This didn't have to be this way because they have time to market issues. They want to make sure they're getting out in front of their customer base before their competitors. And so I understand the urgency, but on the same token, these devices in a lot of cases can't be upgraded remotely, can't be managed. And unfortunately, a lot of this consumer-grade cruft out there ends up being a problem that lingers, and it won't go away anytime soon.
Yeah. This is going to be really strange. There used to be a fairly definable ratio on the number of security people per number of devices on the network. All of a sudden, IoT happened, and the ratio just exploded. Now it's not going to be, I'll make some numbers up, it's now not going to be 1 to 10,000, it might be 1 to 100,000. Yeah. So that's going to be a large scalability challenge. Then what happens is you're going to have internet-connected light bulbs and aquariums that one just was used to hack a casino.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden you're going to have these default insecure devices that you have no hope of protecting that are going to start attacking your enterprise. And that's going to be a very strange world where we're going to have so many internet-connected devices that it's going to present very unique scalability challenges on the defense side.
So what's the answer? Is the answer better visibility? Are we ever going to gain visibility over all those devices, or is it air gap networks? Like how do you talk to customers about how to solve those scalability challenges in the near term?
From all I've seen in security, let's say we take a long view, the last decade of breaches. With rare exception, have we been hacked by something that completely surprised us that we did not know how to protect? Usually it's just a patch or a config or a proper password. We have all the technology know-how, even without AI, to stop all these things. What it really comes down to is an incentives issue. How do we incentivize the right people in the right position to do the right things at the right time? And then we can get to the technological answer. I think we're going to need either voluntary or regulation to put liability in the system, whether it's from the supplier, for the custodian of the data, because I don't see a way around it. We know all the answers, it's just the right people aren't doing them.
Yeah. You mentioned the R word, so I'm curious, what do you think is the role that regulation should be playing here today? We have things like GDPR coming out. Is regulation helping? Is regulation hurting? Where is it helping? Where should we be doing more?
Typically that's not something that I would comment on, but I mean, something has to give.
Yeah.
Right? So GDPR is really great in that it's enforcing accountability.
Yes.
So people are like focusing on the fines and things like that, where it's actually the accountability, which is something that should have been there all along. Yes. And I think that's a great vehicle from that conceptually. We'll find out after May 25th how that actually is going to all play out. But you know what, that remains to be seen how that's going to work. In some cases it has helped, but it's not always going to play out the way we think it is, because more often than not it tends to be a horse by committee.
Yeah.
So
it's going to be interesting. I'm really interested to see how GDPR plays out, because what I think I like, I'm not a GDPR expert. One of the things I like about it doesn't mandate particular controls. It enacts liability, and then becomes the company, the custodian of the data's responsibility to figure it out, which is the best probably regulation is going to be able to do, is try to correct some of the incentives that are out there. What I am personally also a big advocate for is voluntary liability. For instance, everything that we buy and consume in life, the cars we buy, watches we wear, jewelry, even video games, come with a warranty, a liability.
Yeah.
Everything except security products and software.
Yeah.
Like how do we get to this point, $80 to $90 billion annually, and there's, with rare exception, very few product warranties to be seen? I think that time has finally come.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you see as the role that cyber insurance, I know we're going way off topic, but I'm just curious, I got you guys, like where do you see cyber insurance playing in some of this? I mean, it's obviously a bit of a wild west out there. There's not decades of actuarial data out there that insurers and underwriters can use. Do you see policies as they relate to some of the work that Akamai does and helps customers prevent? playing into your business model or the attacker's business model?
So I haven't seen it in that perspective, but what I did was when I was writing an article for a publication, I went and I pulled down a lot of the checklists that people had to fill out in order to apply for cyber insurance.
Yeah.
And in a couple of cases, I was looking at it, and there was absolutely no way somebody could actually fill this out honestly and submit it, because the windows that they were proposing within this documentation that you would say yes or no to, it really doesn't bear out based on the information we've seen. But that being said, I mean, I know he has a lot this particular topic.
Okay, good. I didn't know that. We didn't test it.
All right, so we have so cyber insurance is going to rise out of the lack of efficacy from InfoSec.
Right.
If you ask the average CISO, what are the odds that they're going to be breached within the next 12 months? Probably 3/4 would say it's more than likely.
Yeah.
You know, after we spent $90 billion on products and services. So if they feel they can't stop the breach, they can stop the loss. So why spend another $50,000, $100,000, $1 million in security products when you can just give it to an insurer who will cover your losses?
Right.
So we can say that there's no actuarial data. Fine, we're going to get paid out in a way that InfoSec never would, because we don't guarantee everything that we do. Given enough years and enough claims data, they're going to be able to adjust the premiums and the risk, and they're going to have the actuarials that InfoSec never provided. It's only a matter of time.
And then do they drive InfoSec and incent the market so that the right kind of tools and standards are in place?
Soon, but not yet.
Yeah.
They're going to say, we'll only cover you, or your premiums are going to go up unless you buy one of these 5 AV tools that we recommend.
Yeah.
And that's going to have a dramatic effect on the market. It's not going to be today. It's not going to be tomorrow. Give it a couple of years, but it'll come.
Yeah. And I agree with him very much that I see that coming as well.
Yeah. It seems to me like, so if you're a CISO today, you just get put in the seat. What are you? Is a cyber insurance policy like thing number 2 on your list, or what are some of the things that you want to make sure you have in place aside from your team, technologies?
So for me, it would be a different perspective, because I've sat in that seat before, and a not enviable seat to be in. Number one, wear Kevlar. No. It really is about, you have to go back and tackle the fundamentals that historically we have moved away from.
Right.
We tend to get wrapped around the axle about 0 days and things to that effect, when we should be looking at, the patches that we've missed, the risk that we've accepted but never revisited, and as well as the defense in depth. So we've gotten away from that in a lot of cases where we're not having the proper security controls in place, but we've accepted the risk, saying, oh, that's okay, we understand that that's a risk. We're not going to pay for the firewall, we're not going to pay for the DDoS service, or whatever it happens to be. And that will eventually accumulate to such a point that the compound interest is such that it's going to be painful when the bill comes due.
That's great.
So cyber insurance or business insurance is usually bought by the CFO, sold to them by a general insurance broker.
Exactly.
Neither side knows InfoSec at all.
It was done on the golf course, right? No idea what they were doing. Yeah.
Fortunately, what the trend is, the CFOs are starting to delegate the recommendations for what policy down to the CISO, who has a much better handle on it.
Yeah.
And in the future, I think in cyber insurance, the policies are going to be hawked by more of the standard enterprise security sales guy.
Yeah.
And then they're going to make recommendations back up to the business that way. What the CISO needs to do is make sure the policy matches to the business risk that they perceive the business to have, and make sure it matches, and make sure like the incident response team is going to be accepted by the cyber insurer when you need to make a claim. That's also going to be very important.
Yeah.
And just the last thing on that one is, when you buy, like for instance, car insurance, one of the things they ask you is, what cars do you own and who drives them? Which is not something, like imagine we write cyber insurance policies today and no one has an idea of the inventory.
Yeah.
So that's why we're working very hard on that one, because we think the underwriters and the customer are going to need to know what needs to be covered, what are the assets and what do they do, and be able to provide a signal to that.
Yeah. Who's doing this well? I mean, obviously, you go out on the RSA floor, everybody's trying to sell to financial services. They're typically seen as sort of the leading edge here of adopting cyber sophistication. Are there other sectors, are there other regions where you guys have been, where you see a surprise in sophistication in a good way?
Particular like cyber insurer names?
Well, no, I'm just talking about in general, like sophistication, less on the insurance front, but just, are you seeing healthcare? Who's winning? Who's behind? Who are you worried about? Who are you surprised by?
That's going to vary from vertical to vertical. Over the years, I've seen a dramatic shift in financial services to the positive side. It's a continual battle. It's never going to end. But other verticals will be lagging in some respects, and it's not through any lack of ability. It's just for them, that's not been their core. They haven't been exposed to it the way financial services have been in the targeting site. So eventually, yes, they will all come up to a greater level of maturity. But for now, I said the easy one would be financial services for me.
Yeah.
So I was fortunate enough to work in web security, or the security of websites, for about 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
And so we got the get out of jail free card to hack thousands of companies and see the security of websites on a very broad basis. So I always used to get asked, like, what are the most secure companies or the most secure or insecure verticals? In my experience, the most secure verticals are online gaming or gambling and adult entertainment.
Yes.
And the reason for that, it was simple when you break it down. If those get hacked and there's lack of confidence, the customers ejected, gone tomorrow, and everybody knows this. The most insecure ones at the time tended to be governments and banks, because neither of which would go out of business as a result of a breach. So their carrying only went so far.
That's great. No, that's good. So you mentioned, just maybe the last question, see if we can get some controversy between the two. You mentioned APTs, and sometimes we get a little intoxicated by things like attribution and actors.
Yeah.
Does it matter? Does it matter, and who does it matter for? Is attribution and understanding the actor a 1% problem, or should we be more focused on it?
Well, see, understanding the actor is more of a case of understanding the threat to your environment. What are the risks that you're having to contend with? And if you can't quantify what the risk is to your environment, that's a real problem. And a lot of organizations like, oh, I need this, this, and this to secure my environment. I said, great, what are the risks are you trying to take care of? And they're like, okay. So the risk aspect is a really big one, and
I guess it depends on the defender.
Yeah.
So it's a little cliche in InfoSec to bring up the book Sun Tzu, Art of War. But one of the lessons that
we couldn't get through the interview without that. I'm so glad you did.
It says in the book, this is war. I mean, they're treating it this way. It's called cyber war for a reason.
Yes.
You have to know your adversary and everything about them. And so, but if you're a defender like the average retailer, are you going to need to know it's APT 492? No, not really. You're going to be attacked by cybercriminals. You generally know who they are. But there is room in the industry to go after these guys with prosecution, with law enforcement, and they should absolutely know who our enemies are, whether it's government or law enforcement. What are their names? Where do they live? So we can go after them. They're going to need the attribution with as much detail as possible.
Yeah. All right, last question. You guys have been around the space for a while and sat in different seats. What are you excited about? Like, and maybe it doesn't have to do with walking the floor at RSA, because maybe that gives you a little sick feeling in your stomach, but what are you excited about when you look out at the landscape of technologies, maybe regulations in some ways, or where the space is going? Something hopeful we can end on here.
For me, it's actually a marketing term that seems to have taken root, is dealing with zero trust.
Yes.
And this is something that we have been doing all along with network zone segmentation, authentication, all the rest of it. These are things that have been in the mix for the last 20 plus years. And now that people are talking about it from a perspective of zero trust, it has reignited the interest and the focus on it, which I think is a focus that should have been there all along. And again, it goes back to accountability and maturity with us as an industry, that now that's coming back, I'm all for it in that regard. Unfortunately, you'll see various vendors will have various different interpretations as to what that is. But I think by and large, the fact that it's focusing back on that and the core fundamentals of stuff that we should have been doing for 20 years, that I think is a positive.
What are the benefits? Like, how do you describe the benefits or the impact of adopting the zero trust models?
You are actually limiting the access to just what you need to have.
Right.
When I was in a CISO role, I made sure that I did not have administrative access to any of the systems in my environment. And my staff couldn't understand why that was. It's like, I don't need to be on those systems. At that point, I'm in a managerial role. I understand how they work. I installed them, but I don't want to be able to have the root access, because if an adversary is going to come after me, I don't want to have that information to give it to them.
Great. What are you excited about, Jeremiah?
I don't know about excited. This is not like the most exciting industry. I mean, if you look at it, our job as information security professionals is to make sure nothing unexpected happens. Our job is to make sure everything works and it's boring for people, no one to know our names. Yeah. So what pleases me is, like I mentioned, I worked for about 15 years in web security. When it started, you could find a vulnerability in the average website in mere minutes. Today, it might take you hours. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that took a tremendous amount of effort at that point. And when we go back to something I said earlier, we know the answers to these problems. We just have to do them. Now we don't have to try to figure out how to defend ourselves. We just got to get the right people to do them, and that gives us hope. That means we know what to do if we can get our pitch down and prove our worth to those that might listen to us. And I think we could do that.
Great. Well, on that, we'll end it. Jeremiah, Dave, thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you very much.